Hi green lovers, it is June 21st, 2022, which means it's the first day of summer in my Northern California Zone 9B garden. And in this video, I'm going to talk to you about 10 things that you need to do to have a successful summer garden. It's 105 degrees Fahrenheit, which is roughly 40 degrees centigrade, so it's a scorcher here. And yeah, it's the perfect day to talk about things you need to do to protect your plants from the hot weather. So the first thing, and probably the most important thing that you need to get right, is your watering of your garden. If you live in a part of the world where droughts are common, like me here in Northern California, this you need to get especially right. In fact, this year I went ahead and installed drip irrigation all over my garden because we are having unprecedented droughts in California and we have to conserve water as much as possible. So one thing that you do need to do if you have irrigation installed is to check the frequency and the length at which you're supplying water to your plants. Now I have my irrigation set up with these electronic timers. You can buy timers with multiple hose connections. This particular one has two, and so I've got station 1 and station 2, so I can water two different parts of my garden at different schedules. You can set the start time, you can set how long it will run for and how often. So once every day, once every 2 days, once every 3 days, whatever frequency you want to set it up to be. But just make sure that you are setting it up to run so that it saturates the surface of the soil as well as up to about 3 to 4 inches into the soil. You should be able to feel that moisture. It needs to be really properly soaked, and that is the deep watering that you need to do during summer particularly, because the water from the surface tends to evaporate very quickly, and the roots of the plant, which are typically in the first 6 inches or so, are the ones that are seeking out water. And so the soil needs to be moist to at least about 3, 4, preferably 6 inches deep. So during summer, I come out here and I increase the frequency to roughly once every 2 days. If I've got a heat wave that is predicted, I would come out here and increase the frequency to daily and sometimes even twice a day. So you'll have to keep an eye on the frequency and the length of time that you water your plants during the summer, and then increase accordingly to make sure that your plants are getting enough moisture. Now plants like tomatoes like really deep watering, and you don't want to water them every day. You preferably want to water them once every 2 to 3 days. But the way that you check that they have enough water or not is by the easiest way is to stick your finger in to the soil right around the root. And if you feel moisture about 2 inches down, then you know that your plant has enough water. And I do feel the moisture there, so I know that this tomato plant does not need water today. Now, one thing that you do need to pay attention to, particularly if you're hand watering, is you do not want to be misguided into thinking that your plants have been watered sufficiently when really they haven't. Let me demonstrate for you. Okay, so I'm out here with my hose. A little bit of a drier part of my garden. Frankly, I've just got some scraggly kale plants over here, so I don't water it very frequently, but I'm thinking I'm doing a fairly good job here, right? I'm watering quite deeply, I think. You know, it's coming at a good clip here, the water. I think that should be enough, right? Let's take a look. Okay. At the surface here, the soil looks really nice and moist. But let's scratch right below the surface. Bone dry. In fact, if you look really closely, it's barely the crust that has gotten moist. And that's because the soil here has become what's called hydrophobic. That's what happens when soils dry out. Particularly if it's peat moss based, it will tend to become hydrophobic, and it takes a lot of water to get it to a point where it starts absorbing again. So the way that you solve for this problem is you need to moisten the soil and then go away, water the rest of your garden, and let's say about 5 minutes has elapsed. You come back to the original spot and do it again. This 5 minutes has given the soil enough time to start to absorb, and now it has lost that hydrophobic nature and it can absorb much better. Now I haven't given it 5 minutes, so obviously it's still hydrophobic, but you get the idea. You've got to do this over and over again. The best thing is not to let it dry out, and that is why I'm installing drip irrigation all over my garden, because it just takes too long to get the soil moistened to the point that it becomes sufficiently saturated. Okay, let's talk about the next thing that you need to do to really protect your plants and keep them happy through summer, and that is to mulch. Let me flip the camera around. Now, I use straw to mulch my plants, but you can use dry leaves, you can use wood chips. There are so many things that you can use to mulch your plants. Now, mulch plays a super important role in conserving the moisture in the soil and also in keeping the plant's roots nice and cool. Now, if you look down here, you can see how moist the soil is, because the mulch prevents evaporation and it also creates a nice protective layer which allows the life in the soil to thrive. So if I dig right under the surface of the mulch, you can see earthworms right there. Right at the surface is where the earthworm is, and that is because the mulch gives it that layer of protection and the soil life really thrives. So mulch plays a super important role, and if you use organic material, it breaks down into the soil and adds nutrients to it. Now, one word of caution with using hay is make sure that you know the source of it, straw or hay, because these days you can get straw and hay that has been treated with persistent herbicides, and that will linger in your soil for many years and cause your broadleaf plants to not be successful. The leaves will curl and it literally poisons the soil. Just be careful about what you use as your mulch, particularly if you're going to be using it to work into the soil and you're not removing it at the end of the season. And you also want to make sure that you're not just sprinkling a very thin layer of mulch. You want to go a good 2 to 3 inches above the soil, because that is what will give it the ample protection that the soil needs to keep it cool, as well as keep the moisture in the soil and keep that soil life thriving. So yeah, mulch. It's probably one of the most important things that you can do for your garden after you've irrigated it well, is to ensure that the water stays where it belongs and doesn't evaporate into the air. The third thing that you need to do to prepare your garden for summer is to make sure that you regularly top dress your plants with some good compost. Now, compost has great water retention capability, and it also helps add nutrients to the soil. So this here is a lovely sun gold tomato plant that's starting to produce some nice little tomatoes. Yesterday I came out here and I top dressed with a layer of compost around the base of the plant. What I had started to notice was, if you look right here, this root structure was starting to get exposed. And this is through when I water the plants sometimes, hand water them, or through just in general soil settling, etc. These roots start to get exposed and you want to keep them covered. So add a layer of compost. It helps stabilize the plant also a little bit and adds nutrients right where the plants need it, and it helps cover up those exposed roots. And if you look at the texture of the soil, the compost that I've used, you can literally see the water retention. And when you press it together, it forms an aggregate that easily breaks apart. So this is really good soil retention, and it's great homemade compost that I've added to this, and I know that it's going to make my tomato plant very happy. The fourth thing that you want to do is always have shade cloth handy. For days like today, we've got temperatures hitting over 100 degrees, and my tomato plants particularly do not like that. I prioritize which plants I cover with shade. The first ones are always the tomato plants. After that, I might look at other plants like cucumbers and squash, and then my peppers, and last of all, my eggplants. Those eggplants are super hardy and they can last through pretty much any heat wave. Things like okra and other heat loving summer vegetables like cowpeas, etc., also do quite well without any shade cover. But your tomatoes and maybe your peppers as well, you need to put some shade cloth on them. If you look around my garden here, I've got shade cloth everywhere. Yep, very important, because once the temperatures reach above 90 degrees, your tomato plants are going to go into survival mode and they are not going to produce blossoms anymore. And in fact, they're going to drop the blossoms that they've already produced. So you want to keep them, producing blossoms, and you don't want them to have to restart all over again. They will restart producing the blossoms, but it's going to set them back, and you want to avoid that as much as possible. So keep that shade cloth handy and check your weather forecast regularly. I check every day to make sure that there's no heat wave coming, because if the heat wave is coming, I'm on top of my game and I've got my shade cloth handy, and I come out quickly and I drape it on my plants. My next couple of tips have to do with containers and how you manage them during your summer garden. Now, containers, particularly these larger containers, can be fairly difficult to move. So I actually have all of my whiskey barrels on wheels so I can push them around. I can't do it one-handed because it is pretty heavy with the soil in it, but when I'm expecting a lot of hot days, I like to move my containers into a place where they don't get blasted by that afternoon sun. So I move my containers, large and small, into a shadier part of my garden during the hot summer days. The other thing that you want to do with containers as much as possible is ensure that they have sufficient moisture in them as well. Moisture and nutrients. Containers tend to leach nutrients very quickly, and the only source for nutrients for your container plants is the container. They can't go out looking anywhere. So you've got to replenish your nutrients on a regular basis. So make sure you keep your fertilization routine up and going at a regular cadence, and then also make sure that you keep your containers well watered and try to move them into a shadier part of your garden. I'm actually going to try something called oyas, which are unglazed clay pots that you fill with water and then you bury them into the soil, and they gradually release moisture into the soil, and they work really well with containers. So I'm going to share with you a video where I actually make some oyas myself and I bury them in this container. So subscribe to my channel if you want to see how I do that. My seventh tip has to do with beds like the one behind me that have not been planted and that I may not be planting anything in during the summer. This is a big no-no. Leaving your soil completely bare is really bad for your soil, particularly in summer, because the moisture will all dry out and the soil life is going to die. And it's just not productive to keep a bed uncovered and unplanted during summer. So what I'm going to be doing to all of my beds that are bare are a couple of things. For some of them, I'm just going to be mulching them really, really thick and leaving them and letting that mulch degrade over the course of the summer. And then for others, I'm actually going to be planting a living mulch, which is a cover crop. So I'm going to be planting, not in this bed. This bed I actually have plans for. I'm going to be planting okra and roselle, so my hibiscus plants, in this bed. But there are a couple of other beds that are not going to have any plants during summer. And I'm going to be planting cowpeas in those beds. They make a wonderful cover crop. And then you can also consider living mulches around some of your plants. Let me show you what I mean. So this here is another form of a living mulch or cover crop. This beautiful purple flowered plant is cinnamon basil. Oh, the scent is just intoxicating and the bees absolutely love it. Now, really the star attraction of these two whiskey barrels where this basil is growing are two citrus plants. This one here is a key lime and this here is a Meyer lemon. But these plants, these huge beautiful plants, are providing a nice canopy that is shading the bottom of the plant and keeping it covered and attracting bees and doing all of that wonderful stuff. And if I move over here, I've got a similar situation. In this case, I've got a fig tree growing in a whiskey barrel, and I've got some lovely strawberry plants that with their large thick green leaves are forming a nice canopy and cover over the base of the plant and producing strawberries for me as well. So that's what I call a win-win-win-win-win. Which leads me to my next tip, tip number 8, which is plant some heat-loving summer crops. Things like the basil behind me loves the heat and can handle heat like a champ, just like eggplant, okra, corn, cowpeas. There's actually quite a few plants that can handle the heat and actually thrive in the heat. Flowers too. Zinnias, marigolds, black-eyed Susan vines, Shasta daisies, all of these love the heat. So yeah, plant plants that actually enjoy growing in the heat. Tip number 9 is to pull out the plants that are past the season of growth. So over here in this bed, I've got some brassicas and things that are past their prime. And I've already pulled out all my peas that were covered in powdery mildew, lettuce, etc. Now, leaving these hanging around in the ground here is going to just attract pests. It's going to attract diseases, and these diseases are going to be spreading to your good plants that are trying to grow and succeed in the summer. So get rid of all these old plants that are just taking up space and causing more problems than adding any beneficial value. And plant some cover crops if you've got nothing else to plant. Tip number 10 is to postpone any landscaping projects that you might have in mind. So if you're going to be redoing a portion of your yard and planting new things, or if you've got some fruit trees that you're planning to put in the ground, or like in my case, I've got this curry leaf plant that I've been for a long time wanting to put into the ground. I'm not going to do that during the heat of summer. I'm going to wait for the weather to start to cool off a little bit, and that's when I'm going to do all of my landscaping projects. It takes quite a bit of water and care and feeding in order to make these plants establish themselves, and the heat is just not going to help that cause. So postpone any landscaping projects, major landscaping projects that you have until the cooler months. I'm going to throw in a bonus tip here. I know I said 10 tips, but this one I think is very important, and that is to leave some little saucers of water here and there in your garden to take care of the birds, the bees, and even the squirrels and other rodents that might visit your garden. You know what? These creatures are so thirsty, and sometimes if you provide them with water, they will actually avoid digging into your tomatoes and other juicy vegetables because they're really desperate for something to drink. And so providing them with a source of water might actually protect your plant. So take care of the little critters that make up the ecosystem in your garden. By the way, folks, it's not too late to plant seeds for your summer garden and your early fall garden. And if you want to check out what seeds I'm planting in my longer season Northern California garden, check out this video right here for the seeds I'm planting in June, and subscribe to my channel to see what I'm planting in the month of July. I've got a list. So I hope you try some of these tips, and I hope you have a very successful summer garden. And until next time, live green and love your greens.